This is the first video of an upcoming series about world cinema, where various films, directors, actors and directors of photography from around the world and throughout the ages will be presented and studied in an attempt to showcase the beauty of cinema beyond the borders of Hollywood and the Anglophone industry. Hopefully these will prove valuable for film students, connoisseurs, or simply lay people with curiosity towards the seventh art, its history and development, landmarks and forgotten treasures. Today's video is about Lетят журавли, more commonly known as The Cranes Are Flying, a 1957 Soviet film by Mikhail Kalatozov, whose partnership with director of photography Sergei Urusevsky would become legendary due to their blend of ingenious storytelling and aesthetic virtuosity unmatched at the time and which would serve as inspiration for many other later filmmakers. The Cranes Are Flying impressed the critics and audience so much it landed a prestigious Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in 1958, and therefore earns the title of being the only Soviet film to ever do so, having awarded as well its lead actress, the beautiful Tatiana Samoilova, with a special mention for Most Modest and Charming Actress. The Cranes Are Flying may look like a typical 50s romantic war film in which a relationship is challenged by unexpected external circumstances like war and latent personal or societal issues, sharing some similarities in this aspect with later Hollywood productions such as The Notebook or Legends of the Fall. What distinguishes Kalatozov's film from other more or less soapy romance films from the same period is mostly its overall directorial brilliance, especially on technical departments such as the photography and editing, both subservient to a skillfully delineated narrative without forgetting its daring historical treatment, its tactful acting and multi-layered character arcs, many of these elements being somewhat of a novelty for the specific film medium at that point in time, either from technical limitations or theoretical/ideological constraints. One will be astounded to observe the meticulous framing and composition on various shots projected onto the film, where the mise-en-scène is set up in a refined and subtle manner, each layer working with the purpose of expressing an additional dimension and texture to its environment. At the same time, scenes are blocked with seemingly effortless and natural consideration, without ever ceding to theatrical or bizarre performances, but instead remaining as frank articulations of real people confronted with conflicting emotions. This allows for the characters to enmesh with the visually described world in which they live in, but also occasionally allows for the world itself to emerge as a significant entity, not simply as a stage for the action to occur. Observe, for example, how the following shots evoke a strong sense of an architecturally enveloped cosmos, functioning as a node to Moscow Cityscape and showcasing its classical as well as modern urban flair, a distinct feature which would be adopted, expanded and developed a decade later in other iconic Soviet films such as I Am 20 and Walking the Streets of Moscow. Another striking characteristic is the use of close-ups in conventional and more extreme variants, as a means to reach inner depths, much helped by dreamy lighting and the silky texture conferred to the surfaces. In shots like these, there's an emotional charge that sparkles and lingers in characters' eyes and poses, transposing for brief moments the medium in which they've been engraved and materializing as if by magic between the screen and the spectator. In The Cranes Are Flying, the actors surprisingly dwell and perform in a Stalinist period representation of pre-war life in Moscow with much realism, ease and unaffected demeanor. Therefore, one is drawn to its historical and emotional immediacy before even acknowledging the pictorial quality that pervades the movie constantly. It's so easy to empathize with the main characters, with Boris presenting himself as a good-looking, congenial, noble and sensitive young factory worker deeply in love with Veronica, his gorgeous, always merry and playful girlfriend, with both actors delivering inspired and stirring performances. Every other character from Boris's family, such as his father, grandmother, sister and cousin, is portrayed with acute pathos, clearly exposing their unique personality, while exhibiting other traits that tie into their identity and broaden their personal complexity. Nearly all characters display at some point or another a less agreeable characteristic or vulnerability of some sort, revealing themselves as flesh and bone humans and not solely as archetypes or propagandistic symbols. It did take some courage back then to go beyond the communist cinematic rulebook and expose ethical and law-abiding working-class citizens and ordinary people with frailties and flaws, while also making a subtle critique towards communist discourse as well as exhibiting the Red Army in less than favorable circumstances. All of these brings some authenticity to the story and its portrayal of the human psyche, something which is at least as impressive as the film's technical feats. As the film is mostly known due to its lavish cinematography, some aspects do deserve a more precise mention. In that respect, spectators will find themselves surprised by the film's many long takes and even full sequence shots, a visual dynamic that at the time was far from being established or even widespread at all, and which Kalatozov would take to its limits in I Am Cuba, while the technique would assimilate and continue to develop, for example in Russia, by the hands of people like Andrei Tarkovsky, and would perhaps reach its peak with Sokurov's Russian Ark. Other sequences, impressed with their elan and modernist momentum, animated by a vivid spirit captured through editing masterclasses. Some memorable sequences manifested on the film ought to be pointed out, such as the deceptively simple yet highly meaningful transition from Mark's feet stepping the busted window glass after the bombing, while carrying a resistant but coerced Veronica in his arms. A scene which then shifts into Boris's feet as he plods along a thick and muddy swamp with his company, while him and his comrades carry an injured soldier. On another splendid sequence, Boris dreams of his return home and his marriage with Veronica, as his family stands beside him, all celebrating in a climate of touching yet bittersweet slow-motion bliss. There's also a famous sequence that sees Veronica, after listening to a reproach by her father-in-law to a despondent soldier dumped by his fiancé, getting increasingly agitated and desperate as she runs away from her workplace. Her mental state and snowballing anguish are so poignant and intensely portrayed through the combined images and editing pace, it has to be seen to be believed, and certainly draws much influence from Eisenstein's and Pudovkin's teachings. A lot more could be said about this exceptional film, like mentioning for example the symbolism of the mirrored bed shots and the spinning shots in the forest and at Veronica's home stairwell, or of Veronica's walks, some free and gleeful, others forced and wistful. Or the dramatic use of Dutch angles as introduced by Dziga Vertov a quarter of a century earlier. Or the use of other types of shots employed back then that are recognizable today. One could also suggest other Soviet films to follow with, such as Ivan's Childhood, Trial on the Road, and The Ascent. Maybe discuss too the impressively choreographed crowded scenes found all over the film. But this film is boundless, and its influence was and still is exerted beyond unimaginable distances. And to dissect it entirely would be not only impossible perhaps, but definitely unreasonable and unfair to those who did not have the chance to lay their eyes on it yet, and deserve to discover it in its wholesome, complete purity. You can obtain a copy of The Cranes Are Flying over at Criterion, a version with fantastic image quality and subtitles. I'll post a link on the description for those interested. Thank you for listening and see you next time.